Hello, very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Now, a world that seems smaller, people and goods moving easily backwards and forwards. Globalism. Well, it's been with us for some time, but is it on the way out thanks to coronavirus? This is Roundtable. Countries may retreat behind their own borders. They may not want to rely on an international supply chain that in this crisis, well, is proved shaky at best. And people could well feel the same, that moving so freely may well have been what got us here in the first place.
As scientists join forces across borders to create vaccines and manufacturers rush to coordinate and deliver critical supplies, not everyone has bought into the idea of global solidarity. The US has suspended immigration and cut funding to the World Health Organization, which is coordinating the coronavirus response, while the EU's slow response in helping its hardest-hit member states, Italy and Spain, has fueled anger. As global supply chains are disrupted, the virus is threatening to plunge billions into unemployment and poverty while straining frail public health services and exacerbating political tensions within and between nations. The response from some has been to call for greater cooperation and global solidarity as the way through this crisis. For others, the answer is nationalist isolation and policies of protectionism and reinforced borders. In some ways, it is a battle of ideologies, globalism pitted against nationalism. Will the international order be reshaped by coronavirus?
A little bit later in the programme, we will say hello to Sir Simon Fraser, once the top civil servant at the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office, who's now managing partner of Flint Global. Also to Elisabeth Braw from the Royal United Services Institute, focusing on how we can all work together to strengthen countries' defences against existing and emerging threats. But right now we say hello to Ian Goldin, Professor of Globalisation and Development at University Oxford, author of The Butterfly Defect, How Globalisation Creates Systemic Risks and What to Do About It. Ian, welcome to the programme. What do we need to do about it?
Well, thank you very much. What we need to do is to coordinate to stop these systemic risks. A pandemic is a classic one. It was inevitable that this would arise. The super spreaders of the good things of globalization, like airport hubs, also are the super spreaders of the very bad things, like viruses. Just like financial centers spread financial contagion, cyber systems spread viruses on the internet, so too our connections, our arteries of globalization spread diseases around the world. And so what we need to do is not stop globalization, because that would make us all immensely poorer. We need to manage it. We need to ensure that we identify pandemics at source. We need to regulate the travel of them, and we need to be able to respond very, very quickly. Pandemics are unusual because they're the only threat of the butterfly defect, this defect of globalization that can really arise anywhere in the world. And so that is a particular challenge.
Were others blind? Because I believe that you predicted that the next major financial recession would be caused by a pandemic. Why did others not see it coming?
I think there's a lot of looking in rearview mirrors as to what the risks are. I think there's a huge complacency, not least amongst financial leaders who believe that we managed to overcome that financial crisis so we can overcome the next, amongst health experts that we dealt quite effectively with SARS, with Ebola, with avian influenza, and that life expectancies are improving and basically the risks are going down. So it's a complacency. It's a real failure to understand globalization as well. And I think it's a short-termism and nationalism. These challenges require more coordination. So the more nationalist governments are withdrawing. And of course, They require thinking about things that might not happen during any political leader's time. And so it's best to avoid spending money on them, many people think. Of course, that short-termism is what leads us to where we are today.
One of the things you wrote was, and we'll see this on the screen, out of the terrible fire of this pandemic, a new world order could be forged. By learning to cooperate, we could not only have learned to stop the next pandemic, but also to address climate change and other critical threats. Now is the time to start building the necessary bridges at home and abroad. How likely is that?
Well, it has to happen. Otherwise, we're going to have a downward spiral of more nationalist governments, more inward looking, and rising global threats. It means we'll have another pandemic, which could be even worse than this one. It means that climate change risks will escalate. It means we'll have other risks, like more cyber threats, like conflict and other risks. So unless we learn to cooperate between countries, we are, I'm afraid, in a downward spiral. So even though it might seem unlikely now, it is possible. You know, the Second World War, during the war, which was an absolute terrible war in which over 80 million people were killed, gave birth to the United Nations system. It gave birth to the Bretton Woods institutions, to the Marshall Plan, to a new way of thinking about how we manage. And of course, it also gave birth to the welfare state. So in these terrible times, we can think forward and we must think forward. The other example is the First World War, in which people became more nationalist. Out of that, we got austerity, we got a penalizing of the people that had caused the war. And out of that, we got the Great Depression, the rise of nationalism and fascism, and the Second World War. So we really have a choice. We're at a crossroads. Either we learn to cooperate and live in peace, or I'm afraid we're in a spiral of more tensions, more pandemics, more climate change, and more trouble.
And would a new Marshall Plan put that to one, see that put to one side? Because that is something I know that you have suggested.
A new Marshall Plan would be only one pillar of reconstruction, but developing countries particularly are going to suffer absolute devastation from COVID-19. We're going to see around the world starvation. We're going to see over 100 countries going bankrupt. And in that process, we need global solidarity. We haven't seen nearly the level of global solidarity we need to see. The rich countries are able to print their own currencies. They're able to support their people and their companies, but that's not an option for many countries around the world, the majority. And so I believe we need that sort of solidarity that a Marshall Plan implies.
You see, one of the things I'm wondering is, might the United States be sidelined in perhaps any other global effort that there is, and something like the European Union and perhaps even China come to the fore in leading a global response? What would that mean to nationalism?
I think it's going to happen. The US tragically has turned its back on the world. It has been the leader of global activities since the Second World War, but now has withdrawn. Worse than that, it's undermining them. It's withdrawn its budget from the World Health Organization. It's creating tensions by calling this the Chinese virus and coming up with all sorts of theories about it. And so we're really going to have to see that other actors, not least the European Union and China, work together to try and build a system, even if the US doesn't initially at this stage want to be part of it. So I think we really have no option but to get on with it. To say, well, we'll wait until the US decides to come to the table would be to wait too long. Those that believe in cooperation need to get on with it.
Ian, sorry for interrupting. I've become used to traveling because of my work and because also it's fun. My children the same. But I wonder what my grandchildren will make of it. What kind of world will they grow up in if globalization looks so very different?
My sense is that they will have one of two thoughts. As we do when we look back today at the Second World War, for example, with our grandparents. Either they will say, this was a terrible moment for humanity, but they learned and they overcame their challenges to create a better world. And as a result, we don't have another world war, and then we won't have another pandemic, and we've dealt with climate change and the other big challenges. Or the grandchildren might not even be alive because they were being wiped out by the threat. But if they are alive, they'll say that was a time which led and precipitated a downward spiral if only they had decided differently.
Utopia or dystopia? I can't thank you for that, Ian Goldin, but I can thank you very much for coming on the program. Great to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we can now welcome Sir Simon Fraser from Flint Global, who has a great deal of international experience from his time at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and Elisabeth Braw from the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome to you both. I finished the first part of the programme by asking our guest whether he saw a bright or a dark future if we retreated in any degree from globalisation. Simon, you first. I'm wondering if you are hopeful or despairing. The question was actually put on behalf of my grandchildren or any grandchildren we may have.
Well, I'm neither hopeful nor despairing at the moment. I think that what's happened is there's been a trend that's been going on away from globalism towards sort of nationalism, reinforced by this new bipolar confrontation between China and America in geopolitics. And the virus, COVID, is reinforcing those trends and sort of accelerating them. And so the question is that a short-term effect? Or is it going to be a long-term effect? Now, the hopeful scenario is that actually when we get through the immediate crisis, in which it's natural that people would sort of pull in and look to their domestic concerns and try to blame other people, but when we get through that, will people stand back and say, well, look, this shows us, as indeed the climate challenge shows us, that we need to find new ways of cooperating in a multilateral system in the world. And if we do have that reaction, then I think there are reasons to be optimistic. But it has to be said, at the moment, we're not seeing that.
Elisabeth, do you think the United States will be weakened, not just politically and in terms of its image, its prestige on the world change by the way it's handled this crisis, but also economically on a scale that is far greater than that might be experienced elsewhere?
Well, I think what will be weakened is the globalized economic system, but that's not the bad thing, because what we have been doing for the past few decades is we, as the global middle class, the ever increasing global middle class, have been relying on a system that is unsustainable. It's unsustainable for the people who work in it, it's unsustainable for the environment, and it's unsustainable for many countries. So this correction is not necessarily bad, I think, and I'm not proposing that it's a good idea to return to all local production, but a little bit of a corrective from that, those global supply chains that need very little disruption in order to have enormous effects on our daily lives. That's not the bad thing. And it's not the bad thing for America or any other.
I was going to say, with technological developments, 3D printing, etc., we may not have to rely quite so much on the way goods have moved around the world in the past.
That's right. And I was just looking, for example, at Procter & Gamble's figures. So they use 387 suppliers in China, and those suppliers' products go into a total of 17,600 products. Now, what if Procter & Gamble, which doesn't make particularly sophisticated products, if they could decrease their reliance on Chinese suppliers or other suppliers in distant countries and consolidate a bit or produce their goods closer to home? And as you say, 3D will help in that context. With 3D, you can print shampoo bottles, but you can print goods and items that are a lot more sophisticated than shampoo bottles as well.
Let me read you something from Richard Fontaine. He used to work for George W. Bush State Department at one stage and then at the National Security Council. He wrote in Foreign Policy, the coronavirus pandemic may mark the endpoint of the post-Cold War era. The enchantment with ever greater international integration is gone, but it would be folly to replace globalization with the same kind of isolationism and protectionism that has impoverished nations before. So, Simon, how is that to be avoided?
I agree with that analysis. But I also, i.e. what's happening, I also agree that it would be very foolish to replace it with the previous form of isolation. But actually, I don't think that's a real risk in the sense that the world is much more interdependent. If you look at China and America, I mean, they are very interdependent and they both have a long-term interest in maintaining stability in the economic system and the political system internationally. So again, the point comes up, they may have short-term interests in being aggressive towards each other at the moment, but in the long term, they do have an interdependence, such as the United States and the Soviet Union, for example, in the past, never had. So while I recognise that maybe some sort of shortening of supply chains, some sort of greater resilience in national economies is desirable, it would be a very bad thing for us all, politically and economically, if that went too far and led to a sort of retrenchment into national or regional blocks again.
Do you think we're going to see, Simon, you first, and then we'll go to Elisabeth, do you think we're going to see a greener world as a result of this, with less travel, with less movement of goods, goods and people?
I mean, I think, first of all, that both the COVID and climate change, in a way, combine to make us, I hope, wake up to the fact that there are global challenges which do require global responses, not just national responses. And that's the challenge. Now, obviously, the behaviours that are resulting from lockdown are having a positive climate impact, but that's only temporary and it's only partial. And it's very interesting that, as I understand the figures, we're going to have about a 5 or 6% reduction in emissions as a result of this lockdown. But actually, to achieve the 1.5% target, 1.5 degrees centigrade target in climate change, we need a 7% reduction in emissions sustained over time. So just behavioural change alone is not enough. We need proactive international policy measures as well.
Elisabeth, I wanted to ask you about the one major international institution that's been quoted a lot in this. It's been maligned, it's been praised in some cases, the World Health Organization. And I wanted to ask you if it could be a body, if it were to be reformed, that could be at the center of a new kind of globalization, a retrenched globalization, but putting countries in touch in different ways, building bridges, as was said.
Well, I think we all hope that the WHO will become such an organization. And here is, I think, the paradox that we're experiencing, which is that global bodies are not as powerful as both their detractors and their supporters thought they were. So that begins with the European Union, which, as we all know, has been maligned by Brexiteers for many years. And when coronavirus struck, it turns out it's the European Union is not as powerful as we all thought it was. The European Commission couldn't force member states to help Italy when it was suffering really badly from the outbreak and needed medical supplies. And likewise, the WHO is not as powerful as a CEO running a company who's then can then report to the board. The board sort of messes around with decision making while it's happening, and that's clearly not a good model in global crises that require strong action and expeditious action.
And if you were to change the World Health Organization for the better, so that it could cope with a new world order, if you like, how would you go about that, do you think, Elisabeth?
Well, I would love to see the Director General, or whatever title he or she were to have, of the WHO having more CEO-like responsibilities, so that he or she could proceed pretty much independently and then report back to the board afterwards, rather than having to be micromanaged to the board by the board at every step. And by the way, hearing from the board that, oh, if you do this or that, we may withdraw funding.
You see, I'm sort of wondering, and this is for both of you, Simon, you first, how you find the right people, persons, bodies to drive this sort of change, because it is altruistic, it is about self-preservation, but at the same time, you're almost cutting off your means of support in the first place by changing your nature. You have to be pretty quick and pretty sharp to do this well.
Well, on the question of how you respond, I mean, the thing about international organizations, given that I think we need international response to this challenge, the thing about international organizations of all kinds is that they can only ever be as good as the member states, the sovereign member states who are their constituent members, allow them to be. And that applies to the EU as it applies in the UN. So if you're looking for leadership, I think you've got to look to, in the end, effective leaders of national governments. And I would say at the moment, we're not seeing that leadership from the United States. One of the very big questions will be, who do the Americans choose to be the president at the end of this year? Because I think that if it were Biden, he would have a different approach to bringing together international responses than President Trump, for example. And then in Europe, who is going to be the leader in Europe who emerges as somebody who can really galvanize international action? And thirdly, what is the reaction going to be in China coming out of this? How is China going to position itself? Is it going to be more collaborative, or is nationalism going to be the primary response? Those are the big questions which we need to think about in terms of future leadership.
Elisabeth, how do you think the world of work will look for future generations if globalization is recalibrated, if you want?
Those of us who work in offices clearly think, many of us think that we'll be working from home, but we have to remember that's a very small part of the global workforce. Most people still work in some sort of physical capacity, and they don't sit in office, and they wouldn't even have the option of working from home even if they wanted to. And so when we think about how workplaces will be reshaped or reinvented, we should remember that. But I think actually, going back to your previous question about globalization, the workplace may change in that products, components, and so forth are made closer to where they will eventually be used, and that will reduce, for example, the number of professions that are involved in the transportation of goods around the world. We should remember that 80% of the world's trade travels by sea, and that's an enormous industry that is very vulnerable to disruption, and by the way is not very well paid either. I think that industry will change as we produce more goods and components closer to home, although of course we'll never reach a point where everything is local, and that wouldn't be desirable either.
I think it's in the last 2 generations, I may be slightly wrong about the time span, but 2 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. They have seen their lives improve. And I'm wondering if with a changed world, a retrenchment of globalization, etc., we are going to think we are poorer, perhaps, or richer. Simon?
Well, I think one of the problems at the moment is that people in the developed economies, the rich economies, have been feeling that they've been getting relatively poorer. And that's one of the reasons why support for globalization is eroding. The people who have been lifted out of poverty, and it's a huge achievement for humankind, have been, of course, in China, in India, and to a lesser extent in other countries, including in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think they're going to continue to get relatively richer. So it depends of where you are. But it does raise the question of, is the paradigm of continuing global economic growth and growth in global trade a sustainable paradigm? And that is where we bump up, of course, against the climate imperative, which is becoming ever more urgent.
So you think we've never had it so good is actually a thing of the past, though?
Well, I certainly think that the people who were born in my generation are the luckiest generation that have walked this earth, and we have had it very good. And unless we can adapt to meet the challenges of the future through technology, through behavior, through collaborative policy, then I think our children and grandchildren may not have it as good in different ways.
Elisabeth, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we have never had it as good as is the case now. And those who complain about the effects of globalization should remember that when they buy an orange at Tesco, it costs them 30p last time I checked. And that orange has been grown by somebody usually in South Africa or a South American country, has then traveled all the way to the UK, has been warehoused somewhere in the UK, and then been transported to their local Tesco or Sainsbury's or whatever their local shop is in the UK or another country. And all of that at the cost of 30p. We have it too good. Goods are too cheap, considering the enormous amount of work that goes into producing them and transporting them to us. And I think we should remind ourselves that it's too cheap, it's unsustainable, and we have to be prepared to pay more for the conveniences that we expect every day.
So we sort of come full circle in this one, because I want to come back to a better world, Elisabeth, perhaps out of a terrible catastrophe.
Absolutely. I mean, how can exploitation of the Earth's resources and of our fellow human beings in other countries be a good thing? It may be a good thing momentarily, but it's not sustainable. So I think whatever political persuasion one is of, it's desirable to correct that equation because it's not going to last. And now this is an unexpected opportunity for us to correct that and to change our habits and maybe to treat the planet and fellow human beings a bit more charitably.
Simon, quickly, because we don't have very much time left, with your vast international experience, will there be forces pushing back against this changing world order?
I hope there will be forces which will be standing up and saying, look, we are one human race, we share one planet, we are vulnerable unless we react together and collaborate in dealing with the problems we face. And I think that we need to be optimistic looking forward. We need to work together, we need to have confidence in our ingenuity, innovation and technology to meet the challenges. But it isn't going to happen if we don't make it happen.
So neither utopia nor dystopia, but somewhere in between, which I think is a happy medium. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us on this roundtable. That's Sir Simon Fraser and Elisabeth Braw. And thank you very much, wherever you happen to be in the world, for watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from the team that put it all together, we hope you stay safe and you stay with us if you can here on TRT World. Goodbye for now.